Is democracy overrated? That's a powerful question. I'm gonna improvise this whole video. I've been thinking about this question a lot for kind of a long time now, for years. By the way, I'm still using my wide-angle webcam. I've ordered a new camera. It was a very expensive one. But in the meantime, we're going to be doing webcam. And, yeah, is democracy overrated? So, there's a clip from a philosopher named Rajneesh that's has a certain level of popularity, we could say. It's this one.
Because democracy basically means government by the people, of the people, for the people. But the people are retarded. So let us say, government by the retarded, for the retarded, of the retarded. Democracy cannot be the highest possibility man can attain.
You can see how Rajneesh, with his sense of humor, was very likable. And he had this kind of modern, no-nonsense thing about him that made him such a charismatic guru and cult leader. A cult leader who could appeal to intellectuals, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. I definitely like a lot of his insights about life. Another person whose insights I've found enjoyment in is George Carlin, famous comedian, and he had this to say about the same subject.
Everybody complains about politicians. Everybody says they suck. Yeah! Well, where do people think these politicians come from? They don't fall out of the sky. They don't pass through a membrane from another reality. They come from American parents and American families, American homes, American schools, American churches, American businesses, and American universities, and they're elected by American citizens. This is the best we can do, folks. This is what we have to offer. It's what our system produces. Garbage in, garbage out. If you have selfish, ignorant citizens, you're going to get selfish, ignorant leaders. And term limits ain't going to do you any good. You're just going to wind up with a brand new bunch of selfish, ignorant Americans. So maybe it's not the politicians who suck. Maybe something else sucks around here, like the public. Yeah, the public sucks. There's a nice campaign slogan for somebody. The public sucks. Fuck hope. Fuck hope.
With modern satire and cynicism, we can deconstruct a lot of things, including some of the most foundational aspects of our thought. There's a quote that is very often attributed to Winston Churchill. I don't know if he said this or if it's misattributed to him or if he was quoting someone else. I don't remember the story around this quote. But it's basically the pithy idea that democracy is the worst form of government except for all of the others. This has a kind of ring to it that is appealing and makes a lot of sense. And I think I and a lot of people are a little bit tired of the constant lionization of democracy. The constant need to affirm and identify democracy with everything good, because democracy is government by everyone, basically. That's the spirit of it, even if it isn't borne out. That's the principle of it at its most basic. But so many of us, when examining who the people are who compose this society, we find them not very worthy of this kind of power. So then the question then becomes, is democracy really the best we can do in principle? Or is there some other way to approach things? A lot of people have had a lot of ideas about this over the years. Ideas that we in the United States are not exposed to very often, and I think in Europe increasingly less. These ideas range from traditionalism to sort of absolutism, to later on we get socialism with its more, I suppose, revolutionary aspect, Marxian socialism, state socialism, as a lot of, I guess, left communists would call it, and then we have third position ideology. Now, I have done a lot of reading into these various ideas. I think I have probably more exposure to these ideas than other people. What all of these ideas have in them is a certain skepticism of democracy. Even Marxism, which sort of thinks of itself as democratic, does contain a lot of skepticism over democracy. And ultimately, I would say also capitalism, which is often identified with liberalism, itself has skepticism over democracy. In that, if we're talking about a people who democratically wish to move away from the international capitalist order, that is often considered a step too far for certain capitalists and liberals. Now, whether this has ever actually happened is kind of debatable, because democracy is one of these touchy things where it's kind of impossible in actuality. Democracy ends up only being kind of a vague idea that we can use as a sort of tool to implement in various systems, but it never actually becomes a reality. Democracy is a set of methods rather than an actual thing in itself, because people don't agree with each other on what they should do. So the concept of a government by the people, of the people's will, doesn't really hold up. You can only ever have a system of voting, and that is what is identified with democracy. Democracy is identified with the principle of voting, and that's the basic machinery that defines all democratic methods. But then what you have there is a step removed from, I guess, the pure, idyllic, intrinsic, beautiful, crystalline democracy toward a thing which is called tyranny of the majority. The idea that the most popular idea and opinion and decision is the one that ends up being the prerogative and program of the body, usually a government. And this idea of, making everything into a popularity contest has a lot of utility to it. It's a very useful way to approach decision making, because it's something that everyone can kind of understand as fair. Even if we don't believe that the most popular decision is always the correct one, we can at least say, well, this is an objective measurement that we can look to, that gives us some idea of what's fair. And there are not very many ways to objectively determine what is fair, but this sort of democratic popularity contest has proven to be a very useful one in people's minds, and it makes sense, I think, to most of us. But there are certain things that I don't like about it. And I think the fact that it is essentially a popularity contest is the big one. Because the fact is that democracy doesn't really get us to truth. It doesn't really get us to the most effective or right path forward. Democracy only goes by what is most popular at a certain moment. And it is pretty apparent to a lot of us that the values of a lot of the population around us are very shallow and not very well thought out, and very susceptible to what is called groupthink, where people will often adopt opinions not based on whether they can determine those opinions to have real value on a critical level, but because those opinions are already popular. And then people identify themselves and their personalities and egos with these opinions that they did very little work to actually formulate. So we get a kind of cascading effect where, as an opinion gathers steam, it can attract more and more people, even if there is no actual merit to it. This is why Donald Trump was elected twice. Donald Trump was not elected because he actually had any value as a presidential candidate. He was elected because he was popular. And there are many ways to become popular other than actually having merit. Democracy also tends to go hand in hand with another concept that is similar, but a little bit different, called populism. The idea of populism is a little bit adaptable, but the basic concept seems to be that it's about treating the kind of majority, or the sort of the bottom of the pyramid of society, as a kind of oppressed voice that is desirous of power in order to lift itself up. But that power is hoarded by some other group higher on the pyramid. So it kind of renders politics into a battle between an elite that is privileged and a majority that is sort of socially and legally a minority in a way. And from there you get this idea of conflict. And this, of course, has a lot of resonance in the left-wing tradition, in the Marxist tradition, in the current American progressive agenda, which, I am sort of part of the milieu of. I vote in that direction, I guess we could say. But also in other areas, in areas that explicitly think of themselves as anti-left. We get this idea of right-wing populism, which has a lot of interesting subtleties and intricacies. But I have to say, I find myself not very satisfied with populism in any form, no matter how it's interpreted, I find myself being very uncomfortable with populism. One of the things I don't like about populism and how it kind of affects politics as a whole is this sort of division that people make into us and them categories. Team-based politics. I don't like divisiveness in politics. I don't like the concept of identifying an enemy in politics. And I think that populism is probably the biggest culprit of this. I don't think it is very stoic or very wise to always be kind of deferring blame for everything onto other people and sort of exonerating yourself and by extension the group that you identify with in all of this. That's not to say that there is no truth, objective truth in any of this. I think a lot of the claims made by populists of all sort in a way, I think a lot of their claims are actually correct on an objective level. However, the problem I have with it is the psychology of it. And the way our words, the way we use our words, the way we relate to our world through language affects our psychology and what that psychology then does to our actions and how those actions create history. It is very easy to lose control of your sanity. And it is easier to do that on a massive scale, on a group level, than on an individual level, which was one of the principal observations made by Gustave Le Bon in his revolutionary work of sociology. Or really just an opinion at the time. The Crowd, a book that had a big influence on Benito Mussolini. Mussolini's answer was to basically take the insights gleaned by Gustave Le Bon and then exploit them, basically seeing this is the realistic vision of how flawed and irrational crowd psychology is. So I am not going to try to make the crowd better than it is on an intrinsic level, because that is impossible. What I'm going to instead do is use manipulation tactics in order to achieve what I think is a right goal, with the crowd as my instrument. There is an intelligence in this approach, but I don't think that there is a lot of wisdom on a broad level in this approach. And I find myself reaching more as time goes on toward the wise end of things rather than the practical and expedient way of things. And I think history has proven that Mussolini's sense of expediency was wrong-headed, and a lot of it was driven by what I would call bigotries that he probably learned from, studying in Lausanne, Switzerland with Vilfredo Pareto, and also just his background as a socialist with a socialist father. He came out of a very populist tradition, a very us and them tradition. And so when, all of this was in the air with people like Enrico Corradini and Angelo Olivetti, sort of infusing syndicalism with nationalism and transforming the populist us and them narrative, the political myth in the Sorelian sense, from this sort of economic warfare to the international warfare. It became very easy for him to see that as the most expedient route to what he always wanted, which was a sort of aggrandizement of his group, whether he was identifying that group as his class or his nation. That's my reading on him so far. But I think that the failure of Mussolini and how it led to his own destruction and his country's destruction in World War II is an example that too many people, even the people who believe they have nothing in common with Mussolini, it's a trap that they all fall into to some degree or another along the way, in greater or lesser ways. It's a trap of egotism. It's a trap of expediency. And it's a trap of what I would call bigotry. And I don't mean bigotry as synonymous with hatred of other people for superficial reasons. What I mean it as is the traditional sense of the word. When I use the word bigotry, I'm talking about the steadfast clinging to an idea or an assumption that you kind of identify yourself with. Everything kind of comes down to the way we use words to interact with our world, the way we cling to certain assumptions. And I think we all do that to some degree or another, but a lot of us lack awareness. And part of populism is this need to exonerate yourself and your in-group. Like one great example of this is, I think it was Maurice Barrès who said this. He was a French nationalist of the 19th century. This was during the Dreyfus affair, the Dreyfus affair as it's sometimes called, when Alfred Dreyfus, an Alsatian Jew who was an army captain, I believe, was accused of being a German spy. And it was one of the biggest, most earth-shaking controversies of the Third Republic. A republic that Maurice Barrès was not a big fan of. And Barrés's position, as he once put it, was that he doesn't know or care if Alfred Dreyfus is innocent or not. But he does know, and he does care, that France is innocent. And for this reason, he is willing to completely throw Alfred Dreyfus, a man of his age and his region. He's from Lorraine. Dreyfus is from Alsace. They had a shared upbringing. But he is willing to throw Mr. Dreyfus under the bus. For the sake of France, for the sake of something almost petty. This idea that France could be wrong about persecuting this Jewish man. That is an example of what I'm talking about. And we see it with, I think my mother actually felt this a lot with the whole Ronald Reagan phenomenon in the 1980s. And I see this looking back at those times, watching stuff like Trash TV and what's that guy's name? Morton Downey Jr. There was this big sense that America is innocent and America can do no wrong. And what this really is the simplification of right and wrong, the simplification of interests into teams. If you are on this team, then you have to get behind this team 100% of the time, and you have to hate the other team. And this affects everyone in every shade of politics, no matter how they view themselves, we're talking about people who always fall victim to this human defect of tribalism. This human defect that affects so much of the population, if not the whole population. So how can we then look at democracy and say this is a good system, when all it is an exaltation of appeal to popularity, tribalism, and bigotry? This is why I emphasize so much in my work, such as in my video about why I admire fascism. I emphasize this concept of finding common ground. I think that is one of the principal remedies to bigotry. And I attempted to do this as well in my recent response that I made to the furry who attacked me. The first response is not to go on the defensive, not to fortify myself against attack, but to find common ground. When I am at my wisest, this is my instinct. This is also why I made that whole video a long time ago called Debates Are a Stupid Waste of Time. Because debates are all about this fortification of ideology and bigotry. And having a real conversation, as I call it, is not the same as having a debate. A real conversation is where two people try to find common ground and look for an answer together rather than in opposition to each other. I don't even consider debates to be real conversations. That is how lowly I view them. Although sometimes they can be entertaining as little sort of drama plays and amusements. They're not conversations. Because communication is not the goal. As a nihilist, one of the observations I have come to is that good and evil, if they exist, are a matter of interests. They are not matters of some sort of objective truth. But everyone has their own interests in life, and interests come into conflict with each other. And the big question of life and statecraft has always been, how do we manage the conflict of these interests? How do we agree even when we can't agree? Democracy and voting is a very good solution to this problem, but it is not a perfect one. Another thing that I don't care for about populism is this way that populism creates a sort of antipathy toward its inverse, elitism. Now, there are cases in which this antipathy is just. There are cases in which it makes sense. For instance, I would say that the old system of sanctioned elitism under the Ancien Régime in France was a very on its face unhelpful institution. Privileging the first two estates at the expense of the third, even though the third realistically had more power and influence than the other two, which is why they won in the end. But I think the memory of this kind of elitism has sort of lived on and shaped a lot of the way that we deal with the concept of an elite, or, to put it another way, a group a smaller group of people within the broader population who are better than everyone else, who have a certain status above everyone else for whatever reason. And my problem with populism is that a lot of the time, this is a misdirected reaction. Because a lot of the time, the populist answer to elitism is to lower our standards, to lower everything to the lowest common denominator and make everything worse as a result. There is a lot of symbolic populism of this strain among what we could think of as the sort of social justice community. I say symbolic because a lot of the ways that it manifests are not necessarily ways that really matter on a practical level, but they still kind of anger a lot of people. And I can sort of see why, but I think the reaction against it has been a bit exaggerated, because I do think that there is value, a lot of value, in showing and appreciating the experience of the minorities, the people with maybe less education, less wisdom sometimes, less status, less money. Those experiences are every bit as valid as the experiences of everyone else. Representing them, therefore, is not a problem that I have. A lot of people, for instance, a lot of conservatives decry modern art. They hate and detest the kind of art that exists to sort of abstract us away from form, because in the old days, art was much more about form and detail and the kind of technical skill that is required to render things very finely. This often produced a sort of elegance that people identify with a certain aspirational quality, and they find that missing in a lot of modern art. And while I agree with a lot of this on a subjective level, on a taste level, I don't agree that it represents a kind of cultural catastrophe. However, I certainly agree with conservatives when it comes to, I think, the position of some of these more social justice types who are like against older forms, who are against sort of technical mastery and form, elegance. A lot of people view these as outdated things. A lot of people hate the sort of great man approach to history. That's a concept that goes hand in hand with this. They believe that history is much more driven by ordinary people, by people who are not elites. But I disagree with this, and I think it gets to this kind of tribalism, this kind of bigotry, this kind of team-based politics, where people insist on putting one thing down in order to exalt another thing. And you see that as a pattern over and over and over, that they just have to put something down in order to, like, they can't just appreciate two things at once. It doesn't compute in their brains. There always has to be some sort of hate, some sort of spite, some sort of cruelty in everything. And I just don't see things in that way. I don't get the point of that. And it doesn't seem very wise to me. I think everything, even if it contains within it a certain conflict of interests, can be appreciated. And I think the conflict of interests isn't something that needs to be averted. And it also isn't something that needs to divide us. It can be something that is acknowledged on a nihilistic level, like there is no truth, but there are interests. And we can acknowledge the validity of different interests while not necessarily having all the answers. Everyone thinks that they have to have the answer to everything, that everything has a clear answer, and that there's something wrong with them or something wrong with the world if we don't know the answer. But again, this is very unwise. And perhaps this is one of the strengths of democracy, is that it kind of acknowledges the fact that there is no clear answer. And because of that, it allows for different perspectives to take over depending on how popular they are. But I think one thing that gets lost a lot of the time in populism is the good aspects of elitism. For instance, I see this probably more with right-wing populism, a skepticism of the intellectual. This again goes back to those days. It goes back to Maurice Barrès and Georges Sorel, who was very against intellectuals despite himself being one. The irony of that never seemed to bother him, which is one of the things I like about Sorel. But with Barrès, one of his quotes that I've seen attributed to him, although I don't know where it came from or if maybe it's a misquotation, but I think it probably does come from him somewhere. One of his quotes is, "It is not reason from which we get our morality, but it is sensitivity." And this positioning of ourselves against reason and against thinking, against intellectualism, is a big problem that I have with a lot of this kind of demagoguery, with a lot of the sort of right-wing approach to politics. A lot of it is delegating our decision-making process to stuff like the Bible. Although in truth, the Bible itself is not a very consistent or approachable source of morality, and a lot of it contradicts some of the most basic assumptions of the people who claim to adhere to it. So again, it's more about sensitivity than it is about any kind of reading. But we get these days a lot of distrust in academia. A lot of people hate academics. They hate intellectuals. I don't think that academics and intellectuals are always correct or are immune from the kind of biases that affect everyone. However, I think that there is a certain standard of rigor in their field, and that standard of rigor acts as a sort of filter that prevents a lot of the worst inclinations of the common man from affecting the conclusions of this intellectual elite. So while they are not perfectly wise and all-knowing, there is at least a process that acts as a sort of accountability for them that the rest of the world doesn't have. And a lot of people resent that accountability. They view it as fake. They don't believe in it because they are ignorant and uninformed and unwise and unworthy of leading society, which gets us back to this point. Is democracy overrated? I would say yes, in a lot of ways. And that is why I consider myself an elitist, and why I think we should think about technocracy more than we do. This is a conclusion I came to in a kind of primitive form a long time ago, maybe 6 years ago at this point. But it becomes clearer and clearer to me how fostering a sort of idea of intellectual elitism and technocracy in the population could be good for us overall. The opposite of what we term kakistocracy, the opposite of government by the least qualified, we have government by the most qualified, not up to the determination of the masses as a popularity contest, but through some sort of institutional means with the kind of rigor that academia has, the ability to filter out a lot of the worst instincts of society, the ability for us to trust in experts who have credibility in their field to make informed decisions that we cannot make on our own because we don't have the knowledge and understanding that they do. I don't have any specific recommendations for how we can implement more technocratic approaches, but I do think that we need to implement more technocratic approaches. That technocracy, in the same way democracy is a sort of collection of methods, all around the principle of voting, that technocracy can also yield a bunch of different methods around the premise of intellectual elitism, and that we can create an elitist society that way. And part of what I like about elitism is aspiration. This is also kind of something I like about fascism, even though fascism is normally considered populist. It does also have a very strong elitist element in it. And I prefer the elitism of fascism to the populism. When it doesn't involve like superficial categories such as race. This idea that we are not good enough and we can always improve and we can always be better than we are, and that we as a culture need to strive to be better than we are, is one that's very appealing to me. And elitism is the route to that, to have an idea of a role model that really is better than us. Populism normally dictates that we are innocent, that we are right, that we are already just as good as we need to be, that anyone who tells us we're not good enough is a traitor. I think this is very shallow, very unwise, very egotistical, very lacking in humility. Now, on a certain level, there is wisdom in saying, accept yourself as you are. Accept things as they are. Because if you create too much friction there, you actually kind of work against the goal of this aspiration. Because you create stuff like resentment, which is just sort of a self-fulfilling pain. I don't think that we need to be like, self-flagellating or anything. But I think we need to have calm, stoic, level-headed humility. I think that is desperately needed. And that is something that democracy punishes. Democracy puts people's interests against each other and encourages people to vote very selfishly, to vote only for what they think will benefit them. For instance, my state in Nevada, back in the 1800s, voted for the Silver Party because, the U.S. was moving away from silver coinage. And that was very much hurting the Nevada economy because so much of the economy was driven by the silver mines. So they had this whole movement, the free silver movement in Nevada. And it was all just self-interest based. There was very little actual focus on what was good for the entire country. It was just on what was good for Nevada. Oh, for these people. We're going to vote entirely in our interests. And I'm not even saying they were wrong to do that. But what I am saying is that it is symptomatic of the way democracy normalizes this kind of behavior and incentivizes selfishness, incentivizes egotism and arrogance, and punishes big picture thinking, punishes people who are level-headed and want to appeal to people's better natures. People who maybe aren't as brash and funny and interesting as Donald Trump, but are infinitely more qualified to lead a whole nation of millions of people. But the one final note I will make about democracy is, I think, its biggest promise, not necessarily its biggest strength, but its biggest promise and its biggest reason why we shouldn't let go of it. And that is accountability. Democracy, more than any other structure or principle in statecraft, promises that people can be, that there will be machinery that is able to hold people accountable for their decisions. Even the most powerful people, to be able to hold those people accountable for their decisions and to prevent them from being totally let loose and being able to do whatever they want. Now, it doesn't always work out this way. And we've seen that a lot in the last year in this country. But there is at least a promise there and a principle there. And when everything is in alignment and people have the courage to defend that system of accountability, then it can work. And it has been shown to work sometimes. That is the main strength of democracy, I think. But those are my thoughts on democracy, why I think it's overrated, and why I think it is indispensable in certain ways, and how I think we can move forward from a purely democratic ideal of statecraft into something a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more wise.